Page Syndrome, How to Beat Writer's Block. I am here with Hugh A. Spencer and Stephen B. Pearl, and we're here to tell you how to get yourself writing again. So we'll start with introductions. I'm Catherine Fitzsimmons. I am the owner of Brain Lag and the author of how many? 4 books so far, as well as a kids book. And I believe
A
I
book
just
too.
said. What's that?
That's a book too. It counts.
Yes, that's true. That's true. This meeting is being hosted on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Attawandarok, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. For more information on native lands, please visit native-land.ca. So, that out of the way, Hugh, would you like to introduce yourself?
I'm Hugh Spencer. I've been working with Brain Lag for, gosh, I think it's about 2011, 10, and I've been privileged to work with Catherine, and we've together produced 4 books. The first being the novel Extreme Dentistry. The second was a short story collection, Why Hunt Flying Saucers, of previously published stories and short stories, and another short story collection which came out this February called The Progressive Apparatus. And as of last Friday, Brain Lag's first hardcover edition, which I think is a thing of beauty, and I'm tempted just to retire, having done the people who did like the 6th season of Mary Tyler Moore. We can't get any better, and so just wrap it up. No, I'll keep struggling along. But it just came out on Friday, and I'm really pumped about it. There's actually a launch tomorrow, launch party. So if you want to attend that, that's great. And I've been writing and ever since I can remember, and I've been published since about 1990. So I've been had on and off spurts with it, and we can talk about that later.
Great, thank you very much. And Stephen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Stephen B. Pearl. I've got about 13 novels published at the moment. Frankly, I lose count.
I'm just getting off the line right now.
But, three of them, soon to be 4 of them, are through Brain Lag. I have the Tinker's World series, Tinker's Plague and Tinker's Sea, and the Freedom Saga, Cloning Freedoms, and coming December, Freedom's Law. And basically, if it's weird, I write it. Then I just hope I can find somebody who'll publish it.
Good philosophy. All right, so let's get started. I'm sure the question on many people's mind, how has the pandemic affected your writing? Would you like to start us off with that, Stephen?
Had more time to dedicate to it. Frankly, it's been, for my productivity, it's been a very good thing. I do start strumming my lower lip with manic glee because of isolationist, and I haven't been able to get to real cons to do sales. So that's been the downside. But for just the writing side, it's been a very positive.
Excellent. And Hugh?
Positives and negatives. I have to sort of say that I'm a bit of a recluse anyway. I've been working from home regularly since 2007, which is quite a while, 14 years, my goodness. And I used to do a lot more business travel internationally, but for the last 5 years, I've been working fairly close to home, and so I'm quite used to sort of working in some conditions that kind of look like lockdown. I did miss being able to go out and maybe have lunch with friends. I am still part of a writer's workshop called the Cecil Street Irregulars, which was founded in 1987, and I was in that first crew that came in. And we have not really been able to meet much. We can't meet at all in person. We've done some Zoom sessions, but it's kind of an area of embarrassment that, as science fiction writers who love technology and embrace it all, we don't seem to be all that good at understanding how to do a Zoom meeting. And so, but we have done a few, and so we'll try to get better. So I have kind of missed that because I do enjoy that workshopping process. I mean, even when somebody dislikes your manuscript, it's good to have it kicked around and discussed. You get around, you talk about market news, you get some gossip about various people. It's all good, and I do kind of miss the cons and that kind of thing. Although I do like these virtual events immediately afterwards, and so I don't have to drive for an hour or two before I can go to bed. Which at my age, so it's had its pluses and minuses. The big project for me wasn't so much, well, first of all, was getting our book out, which was great, but I think it went in just before the pandemic. And no, I think it came in it just as a pandemic. So we got to work on that fairly in a dedicated way. But so that was great. And I think the other thing is I put together a website called the Retrograde Mentor, which is taken from one of my short story titles, and you can find it if you Google it, or if you go to www.fantasticwriter.net. You can find it. And it was nice to sort of get an overview of my work. I now have to update it to get the new book in, featured and all that. But I was able to put a lot of my work together. So it was good in that sense. Frustrating in that I had a couple of radio plays that I wanted to get into production with my friends out in San Francisco. And they sort of said, no, forget it. We're not doing anything for a while. And we're doing very slowly. So I was hoping to present you with a copy, a radio version of the short story we had in our short story anthology, which is about the speed of light or whatever. See, what
The
was
light,
our
the light between the
between,
stars.
light between the stars? I'm so sorry,
Oh,
I
it's
folks.
fine.
I'm almost a senior citizen, and I lose things, and the pandemic is not good for memory. So
Yes,
that's all
I
I
can
have to say.
definitely concur there. For my own part, um, I at the beginning of 2020, I uh, my New Year's resolution was to write the first draft of the third book in my epic fantasy trilogy, and uh, for me, mainly it was just kind of getting used to it in terms of the pandemic. It wasn't that I had more or less free time for writing, but prior to the pandemic, in the first part of the year, my daughter was doing a lot of extracurricular activities, so I'd be away for an hour to 4 nights a week. And I decided, well, gee, if I'm just waiting around for her to finish up her skating lesson or her piano lesson or whatever she's doing, I might as well bring my computer and write. And that was quite effective. So when we had to go into lockdown, I'm like, but my designated writing time. But for me personally, setting myself a goal of 10,000 words a month really helped me finish that project. And, kind of tried to keep the momentum going with editing since then. So I think I kind of hinted at the answers with the last question, but do you find writing stressful or stress reducing? Hugh, would you like to start us this time?
Yes, is the quick answer. Uh, it's it's usually not too stressful, because if I find it too stressful, I just stop doing it. And back in the days when I was the sort of two modes I have. One was the Hugh Spencer, the writer, who would consume about half a quart of rum a day, which would get me so relaxed that I would write. I just put anything down on the paper, and that was one. But one way of dealing with stress is you just sort of self-medicate yourself in ways that are not very healthy. The new mode is the Hugh Spencer that has a glass of wine a year, which is sort of to change those habits so it doesn't do that. So I often just stop doing it, and when it gets stressful, I because I don't really set targets. I'm thinking I might try that just to see how it goes, but I often at least I used to, and I still do, I just go out for a walk We live in nice down by the lake, and it's not a fancy neighborhood or anything, but we're near Lake Ontario, and so you can just go by the trails and just look at the thing, and that often helps a lot, and you come back and get back to it. Another thing that made writing quite therapeutic was, and this is something that I owe to my wife, was, and it's not what you think I'm going to say, is she got me a birthday present one year, which was a writer's training session put on by the Toronto Public Library by a writer. I can't remember her name. I have it written down somewhere. And just sort of tips for getting past things like you're talking about, how to become a writer. And she talked about the sort of, don't think about your first draft is sort of your stream of consciousness. And so she sort of said, don't edit yourself when you're driving. Just get the ideas out on a piece of paper and do it without as much self-reflection or self-editing as you can. Because if you are pursuing the dream of producing a perfect draft in the on the first, the first thing that comes off the paper, that's a myth. It's a terrible thing. It's perfectionism, self-destructive perfectionism. Don't do it. Just write out whatever comes out. If it's garbage, throw it out. It probably isn't. You can work with that and edit it and come up with a quite respectable draft. So I do that with I do that with all my first drafts. You can do it either on your computer or you can do it longhand with a comfortable pen, I suggest. And I find actually that process quite therapeutic. That because I don't worry about it, I'm just expressing myself. It comes out. Maybe it's a form of journaling, and then I go back and actually try to write something that might be appealing to somebody else besides me. And the biggest drawback of that approach is not being able to read my own handwriting when I'm coming in to input the longhand into the computer. But it can be very, when I try to, particularly when I'm writing on a topic or a subject, like I have to write professionally and have to do it directly in the computer, I do find that quite stressful sometimes.
Thank you. Stephen.
Well, I chuckle because there are so many parallels between Hugh and I, and then we diverge in incredible areas.
And we were separated at birth. We were twins.
Like I cannot read my own handwriting, so I cannot work longhand. It's basically looks like scribbles on the page. You might mistake it for Arabic if you don't know Arabic. So I do everything on the computer, but my process is I normally will write it. And then, oh, mine's worse than that. But normally I'll write it on the computer. And then within the next day, I will do my initial Passover edit, because even on the computer with my dyslexia, I get to the point where I can't even decipher what I'm trying to write.
You have dyslexia too? We are separate.
Oh yeah, severe. Without a computer, I'm basically grade 6 at best.
I didn't realize you did as well, Hugh.
Well, it's not that severe, and it is actually when I'm feeling pushed or stressed, it'll flare up, and it often is more with numbers, but sometimes, my mother used to say that I had trouble spelling the easy words, the complicated words, which were the interesting words when I was a kid. I could spell perfectly, but I before E, what on earth are you talking about? What difference does it make if the I goes before the E?
Yeah. Well, in English, it's interesting to note that English has a higher percentage of dyslexics than any other language, because English doesn't follow its own rules. The other languages that follow their own internal rules more consistently have substantially fewer dyslexics, because what happens is we get encoded with the first thing that we come across, and that sticks. And breaking that encoding is murder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And this whole thing of, well, you have to take notes in class. So you're rushing to take notes and you're misspelling it because you don't have time to actually process what the spelling should be. Consequently, the school system is generating people with a problem because it's saying you must take notes and you're writing it down wrong.
Well, what was very liberating about this workshop I took about this sort of stream of consciousness draft was that you realize, hey, these are my notes. And it doesn't matter if it's spelt right. And one of the things that's really unfortunate about, at least the way we were taught English as kids, was that you still have this horrible grade 2 teacher. I have a story about my grade 2 spelling teacher, Mrs. Martinson. Awful, horrible old crab apple tree of a lady. And she was teaching us about contractions. And she said, now, Hugh, and this is me like 7 years old. And she sort of says, now, Hugh, if do not becomes don't, what is the contraction of will not? And I sat there and I thought, I'm 7 years old. We all acknowledge there was a lot I don't know at 7 years. And, actually at 64, I still don't know a lot. But I sort of thought, do not, don't. Okay, maybe I can figure this one out. And I said, oh, will not is wilt. And he said, there's no such word as wilt. So she just went up there and took a strip off me, a stupid kid. And I thought, well, I think I should at least get a point for problem solving.
Absolutely.
But no, wilt wasn't it. It was one of the things you talked about. But what it really did is it sort of burned Mrs. Martinson into the back of my head all the time. So if I'm writing too slowly on the first draft, she'll start showing up and tripping me up, and I'll worry about stuff that has nothing to do with my characters and my story. And it's got everything to do with the details that need to be worked out later. She's fine. She can give me the second, third draft. She's welcome. She have a cup of tea. Find out, get her off her feet. That's probably why she had corns or something. That's probably why she's so grumpy. And we can work it out. But she can be useful. But anyway, sorry.
Actually, that would be a great one for another panel. The evils the school system has performed.
Well, it was good and bad. I had some great teachers too.
All right. So,
although my grade 3 teacher made the mistake of getting married, and I'll never forgive her for that. She was supposed to wait for me.
So, getting back on topic, if I may. What do you do when you just don't feel like writing? Stephen, would you like to start us off?
My basic rule about not feeling like writing writer's block is if writing is so onerous that I'd rather do housework, work on the car, or do some of the gardening that I need to do around this place, then I'll do the housework, work on the car or some of the gardening until it becomes more onerous than writing. And I just don't let myself stop. And I think that's where a lot of people run into problems, that they go, oh, I'm blocked. And that becomes a wonderful excuse for not doing. Well, pick things that you need to do. And you can change pace. And the old thing is a change is as good as a rest. But never stop. You're doing something. And maybe you'll shift from doing creative to doing editing on another project, but you just don't let yourself stop. And you might find that your house is really clean by the time that you come back to it and say, okay, I'm now ready to write again, but at least you got a clean house out of it. I've been productive lately. You shouldn't see this place. It's horrible.
Good answer. Thank you. Hugh, what do you do
What was the question again?
What do you do when you just don't feel like writing?
Well, I guess I don't write. I mean, and if I was to apply, if I was like Stephen, my twin, otherwise, you would think I'd just finish a 10-volume series from the state of my office, but it's not. It's just I kind of like a degree of clutter because the process of cleaning up can actually be kind of creative in itself. As you look through stuff, and it's sort of like a personal archaeology, and you can discover things or evokes memories and stuff, which is kind of fun. Because I usually don't have. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here, but most of it is sort of still fun. Otherwise, it'd be here. But I think I was very lucky in when I was being raised because I came from kind of a very creative family. We were all kind of into stuff, ballet or art, or music or something like that, and cake decorating, cosmetics, and some of us were also interested in writing. And what often happens is that, and particularly if you go to my writers, my website, you'll find that I do a fair bit of illustration in my spare time. And I sometimes, because when I'm writing, it means because I probably feel the need to create. I want to create something. But if the writing isn't sort of flowing, even with the stream of consciousness method, I either write a letter to my family, some of the family, because I started doing that during the pandemic, which was fun. Writing these, very antiquated snail mail letters and stuff, and people like getting them, and then they write right back, and it's sort of a neat, because it's much more considered form of communication, and that's a good. So you write something that's not directly related to your story. The other thing is that I may just go and do some illustration for a while, or take in some music and think about that. Also, I was a frustrated filmmaker. I also like to do a bit of photography sometimes. So sometimes I work in another media, and sometimes that even inspires the writing quite directly. Because I remember at one time there's a story in the Why Hunt Flying Saucers collection, the Hospital for Sick Robots. And I drew an illustration of a pastel drawing, apropos of nothing, of a robot, sort of a 50s style robot, humanoid robot, sitting in a wheelchair, and he was blue. And I then looked at that, and I looked at that, and I looked at it, and sort of a story came out of that, which became about these people that thought they were blue robots, red robots, or green robots, and they're actually veterans. That also was based on some work I was doing for a possible Veterans Museum in the United States that never came to anything. But that's another thing, is that you sometimes pull things from your day, your other aspects of your life to inspire stuff. But so they can sometimes cross fertilize, and that the drawings can help, and sometimes end up producing art that nobody but means can understand, have any meaning for, but it's still useful in that sense. So that's sometimes what I do.
Nice. I love the kind of two ends of the spectrum here. We've got Stephen, who, when you don't feel like writing, do the most menial work, you can think of. And then Hugh's, when you don't feel like writing, well, just do something else creative. So, really,
I'll do
any.
anything to avoid work. As you
Exactly.
can see, the difference between me and Stephen is he works, and I should do more work.
So, what about blank page syndrome? When you're looking at a completely blank page and there's so much potential and so much chance to go wrong, and you just feel kind of stumped and you don't know where to start. Do you struggle with that, Hugh?
Well, I think I kind of answered that question on the other thing, because if I'm staring at a blank page too long, I'll start drawing pictures on it. And that may start me up, or maybe I'll end up with an interesting picture, and that's kind of neat. The trouble is, if that's sort of the question of being sort of a marketable commercial writer, that doesn't always help.
It's a good
But again,
it's a good answer though.
but you do that too, I think, because you're also an artist,
Yes.
and a lot of the design and the aesthetic of Brain Lag is attributable to you, the work of you and your partner. And that's one of the things I enjoy working about here is that we have, I mean, folks, this is a freaking fantastic book cover.
Uh,
It,
oh
if you
yeah.
can walk past this and not buy it, you're crazy. I mean, you know, you hate literature and you're just a bad person. Buy that book. It's well reasonably priced, directly to the Brainlag website. Anyway, so that's part of the answer. The other thing too is that I've often find that when I've pushed at the blank page, I've actually ended up with uh, stillbirths. You know, I've forced myself to write something. I've got one book set in a museum I used to work in England that was built at the turn of the century, and it had a Victorian era evolved primate and all the stuff. And I thought this was such a great idea, and I've never gotten further than page 25 of the manuscript. You know, I keep running up to it, and I get another couple of pages, and it just dies, and it just dies, and it's been dying on my in my notebooks and on my computer for about 25 years. So I think it, I don't know. I don't think it might have, I don't think it's going to happen. So sometimes it's blank page is God's way of telling you, don't write this story, right? Go write something else, find another page and work on it, you know,
Fair enough.
go work in the library or the park.
Sounds good. Stephen.
Well, my thing with blank page is I just start writing, and I might do, okay, I've decided the lead character's name is going to be John. I'll just write John sat at the control board. And then I will continue on with that and continue on with that. And I may scrap the first 5 pages. I routinely scrap the first few pages or compress them incredibly so 5 pages become one paragraph. But by doing that, I set up a pattern in myself that gets the dross out. And once the drain is cleared, the fluid can flow. And that's what happens. It creates a foundation that has to be discarded, but that I can build from that and start to go forward. And I always come back to my beginning and rewrite it. So I know going in that first 5 pages is going to be majorly compressed. But it's amazing how much stuff you can get in that first 5 pages because you know you're just going to discard it, that you can sprinkle in later on because that's where a lot of the ideas and the foundation come from, even though you never use it. So it purges the pipes, as it were.
Very good. Thank you. Um, Hugh, you were talking about this a little bit. What what do you do when what you're writing just isn't coming out? You know, you're trying, you're writing, and the words just kind of fumble and it's not working.
Well, I don't send it to you. I try to make that avoid doing that. Um, it's actually interesting because I've tried a number of techniques. Back in the day when Ryerson was a polytechnic and not a university, and when it was no one be Ryerson, um, I studied the screenwriting course, and we were all. This is a roundabout way of getting to that, Catherine. Sorry, it's, we were all given this book by Sid Field about this called Screenplay, and it was sort of the Bible that we were all supposed to use about the structure of how to write a successful dramatic film, commercial dramatic film. And this is again the mid 80s, which is kind of a fairly conservative, creatively conservative time in cinema. And he said things like, which seemed to make a lot of sense: know your ending first. know how it's all going to be at the, know your last 5 pages before you know your first 5 pages. And there's a 3-act structure, and at this point, each of the escalating levels of conflict and resolution at each act and all that stuff. And now, and this was everything we had to do was according to that. And what I ended up doing was writing a lot of stuff on index cards, like you do when you're doing a spoken presentation, and it looked like a murder board sometimes. And you put all this stuff up about here's all this stuff happening, these different characters through this as Act 1 unfolds, Act 2 unfolds, and I had a simplified way ultimately of doing that with just writing sort of bubble diagrams and writing the things blocking out how a big sort of like a novel works out. And it's funny because Sid Field is widely repudiated now. People say, no, you don't write like that. That makes totally formulaic, boring movies, and don't anybody write like that anymore. I think they still do apply it, but there's been a lot more open acceptance of more experimental or wider range of narrative forms in books and films and stage plays and all that. But diagramming can be quite cool because you can sort of break it through and see how things might work together and put that. And I certainly did it with Hardside. I certainly did it with, did a lot with Extreme Dentistry. Now, I didn't actually apply the diagram because I actually got to the point of writing that part of the story. I thought I got a better idea. But I didn't forget a bit important point when I was working on it, because when you get really inarticulate, pardon me, and unable to write something, is when you don't know what you're writing about. You don't know what you're talking about. And it's like being underprepared for an exam or an oral presentation. You don't know enough about what it is you're trying to say. And so diagramming about it, sometimes researching it. I mean, you might notice I have a lot of books, and I like going to the movies, and I like learning about stuff. That's partly to fight off dementia, but it's also you're feeding your head about stuff to draw on when you're drawing, because a lot of the process of your writing is completely unconscious to you. It's a thing that just goes inside you quite materially, but you do have to stuff it in. And there's actually a lot of people who talk about the creative process like that, is that you really have to feed your brain on a subject, or even not on a subject, or something that interests you and somehow feels related to what you're trying to say. And then it will come out in some way that will flow out in some ways. So that's my view. Or at least that works for me.
Yeah.
And it avoids work. It's excellent.
always a good outcome. So, Stephen, what do you do when what you're writing just isn't coming out well?
I edit. I give myself a break away from that. I'll work on one of my other projects. I'm sort of like the guy from the parable who has one talent. I can't draw flies. If I was covered in syrup, I couldn't draw flies. It's just not. I'm not artistically inclined that way. I'm good with technical things. I can take up to about the 1980s. I can take a car apart and put it back together, and it'll run just fine. When you start getting into microchips, I'm a little bit lagging. But that's where my gifts tend to lie, and writing is my creative outlet. So I don't really have the option of shifting to something else. So I do something else inside writing, and there's always plenty. I've dusted off a manuscript I wrote a couple of years ago, and I'm giving it one more brush over before I start sending it out. And it's well, that's it. But I just shift gears.
Oh, that sounds good. Along that line, how do you deal with getting distracted by other projects? You want to start us off, Stephen?
Doesn't happen. Just generally speaking, I'll have 2 or 3 projects I'm working at any given time, and as long as I'm working on one of those, I count it as being on point, because I know that I need to flip around mentally to be able to work on anything. But by having those let's say three projects, I'm able to flip to different stages in my creative process to give it a rest for maybe the rough draft stage has gotten stale, so I'm flipping to the content edit, and then maybe I'm sick of the two of them and I'm flipping to just the line editing. So as long as I'm on one of those, I'm fine.
Very nice. And Hugh, how about when you get distracted by a side project?
Well, I think the biggest distraction as a side project was my kids. You know, I mean, the one thing I'm amazed, Catherine, of your ability to run the show, who doing as much as you want with brain lag in your own work, with Natasha being the age she is, and it's pretty phenomenal because when my boys were the equivalent ages, I maybe got 2 short stories written in 6 years or something. So, and I was having a good time. I really had a lot of fun with my kids, but and it was all great. Wouldn't change any of it, but was a reality. But although the other thing I wanted to mention to you, if there's anyone in the audience on that, your story was very similar to something I read from in an interview with Ursula K. Le Guin, in that she found that her career as a novelist started to take off when her children were very small, and there was a 1 to 2 hour window every evening where she'd put her children to bed, and then she had 1 or 2 hours free to write before she went to bed. And that was how she actually managed to get a bulk of a lot of her early work done before before they grew up and she could become a professional, was writing full time, and she had other work too she was doing professionally. So it's just sort of interesting you have a similar approach there. It seems to work. You can pick up your Hugo next year. This was just a topic of discussion we had a lot in the Cecil Street group, and I think it was particularly in the early days of the group. We were all kind of trying to find our voices as writers, and we'd sort of work on something and then get spun off in anything. And I think somebody quoted Robert Heinlein, said, "Never work on more than one thing at a time." And I guess that's what worked for him. And I guess the short answer to your question is that everybody's got a different process and everybody's different about these things. And so if me and Stephen don't do anything that resembles what works for you, don't worry about it. It's you. No, that's right in your story. I find to a certain extent, but that I can go, but I find now that I reflect on it, the different projects I have going simultaneously tend to be in different media. So I might be doing a radio play and I'm working on a short story or novel at the same time, or doing some illustrational work at the same time, or writing some, and so it really is a big change of gears, and it's kind of a rest from the writing, which is good. One of the things I do find is that if I have too many uncompleted projects, they start to jam me up, and I can't get any of them done until I get the most pressing one of them done. Otherwise, it's just going to weigh on my mind so much that it's going to prevent me from doing it. So, like today, I've been working on a report for my day job, and I finally finished the last segment chapter that needed to be written. Pardon me, which is, I can already feel some floodgates opening because it's not there anymore, and I don't have to think about it. So that's a case that, yeah, I don't work as hard as Stephen, and I'm not as mentally versatile as Stephen. So that's why he has 13 books and I have 4.
Well, it's not about 15, comparison. 17,
32. Of course it is. We're guides. IQs and waistlines. That's what we want to find out.
So we have...
I don't stack up on the latter one at all, and I'm questionable on the former. So
I never quantify those, as I said earlier.
We've got a couple of comments in the chat here from Joel Ater. I start a project like Stephen. I journal about what I want to write about. A few pages in, I might write a paragraph that will get saved. Then more description, waffling around, etc. Then maybe a couple paragraphs that are worth keeping. About 5 or 10 pages in, just about all of it is the book novel project. And he says at least it's all going into the first draft. So thank you for that input, Joel. All right. Do you have a writing schedule that you keep to? Hugh, I think I know the answer to this one, but if you'd like to.
When it's going, it's going. When it's not, it's not. And I think I'm now getting sort of I'm trying to make myself not feel guilty. I've got half a story that I need to get back to now that I've got these other things out of the way, and I will. It's not a big deal. And I actually do find, I joked about deadlines. I did actually find for the Light Between the Stars, having that target, for that anthology helped get that story done. So that was helpful in that sense.
And yeah, you mentioned in the intro to that story that you'd had that story in mind for, gosh, was it like 30 years or something since the 80s?
I have a very long germination period. I'm like about, a pregnant elephant, but worse. It just sort of gestates forever. Like the strategic dog patterning is the same thing. Just went on forever. I got to write the dog story. I got to write this. And finally, I write it.
Excellent.
It takes about 2 weeks to actually write the thing.
Well, a story takes as long as it takes to write. Stephen, do you have?
That's the you do.
Normally, I'll plug away at it in any free time that I have, and just try to get it down, because I came to kind of the realization that I'm probably not going to get everything written that I want to get written before I die. I'm turning 60 this year, and I'm looking at it and saying, it's just not going to happen. I have too many ideas that are still bopping around. And that's not meant to be morbid. That's just meant to be pragmatic. So I devote a lot of my free time to it, and I try to have a schedule. But again, the whole thing of if I'm stuck, I call it a work schedule. If I'm stuck, I'm working on the house or housework or something like that. So yeah, I have the scheduled time, but it's not necessarily going to be spent writing. Would like it to be spent writing.
All right, thank you. Well, I guess that kind of answers what I had as my next question, which was what to do when you're short on ideas. So, if you don't mind, we'll just address Hugh for that question.
Go for long walks and read. And again, I think I mentioned how I've sometimes used my artwork as a means of sometimes stimulating ideas. And I think some people draw those little mandalas and those patterns and stuff and even if they can't, they feel, first of all, Stephen, you can draw. We'll talk about this later. There's again, another myth of photographic realism. We have cameras for a reason, we have computer software, that's not really what drawing's about. I mean, I admire a lot of people who can do that, but there's there are many other important purposes. And one is just to, you say, free it up and get the sluice. I think one of the problems I've had during the pandemic and in recent years, actually since 2016, is that reality has gotten so weird that it's outstripping science fiction. And I don't know if I can come up with anything that's strange enough that works as fiction. So that I think is that is one of the things that's actually kind of kind of tripped me up lately. But there's other ways of looking at stuff, and again, that's one of the things that amazes me about Stephen's work is that he's always you know searching out there and finding ideas to talk about and to explore, and that's wonderful, and that's really the main thing is that sometimes, and again, some science fiction writers have talked about this, is that a good story, I don't think just science fiction or fantasy, is the equivalent of you're sitting around the fire, you're sitting around with your buddies, and you're just talking about you're shooting the breeze and trying to tell a good story and hold their attention. And that's really where the ideas will start to germinate, because one creates the next and leads the next and leads the next until they all, like, now people want you to be quiet.
Interestingly enough, I used to do bardic storytelling, and that's quite the experience.
Wonderful. Were there any particular challenges with that compared to writing?
No, actually, in some ways, it was much simpler because I tended to tell traditional stories. So I'd be doing stories on Cuchulainn and the various and sundry Norse gods, and just sit around the fire and entertain people with stuff that have been stories for thousands of years.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and of course, as people say, there are no new stories. Everything is just kind of a rehash of something else. But yeah, it's fun to see how everybody reinterprets things and, brings their own spin on it.
Catherine, may I share a live storytelling experience story, or do you want to stick to the?
Absolutely.
Okay, there was one thing is that anyone who's listening, if you're contemplating writing for stage or screen, or even radio drama or podcast, audio drama and podcasts are great. So happy to see them resurging. I recommend the tradition of a table read, where you get the script and you get some actors around there and they do readings of the script. You learn a lot. You come up with it's like there's your second or third draft on the page. You learn a lot of what's working and what's not working before you actually have the audience there who paid money or get mad at you if it stinks. But there was one group, I think they shut down a few years ago, but something else will come up around it in Toronto called cold reads. And people would send in segments of scripts they're working on for TV and films. And then these actors in Toronto who, the Toronto, there's a lot of people working commercials and bit parts and stuff, a lot of aspiring talented types. And they'd rent the upper room of a pub, and we'd all sit around. We all come in and pay a ticket and for $5, and they'd spend an evening reading excerpts from these scripts. And another thing I do to sort of keep my creative juices going is if I take a short story, I'll write it up as a radio drama or try to write it as a film or a stage play or something. As again, even when you return to something you've already written, you look at it with this wholly different processes with these things, because what works in a story is going to work in a stage thing, or a radio thing won't work in a film anyway. But it's interesting to work through those problems. And but anyway, I wrote a stage adaptation of one of my stories, a triage conference, I think it was, and they performed a scene from it up on stage with just some people. And it's cold read because the actors just grab this. They haven't seen the script before you do it. But I wasn't the only person who had, and I was very happy with what the actors did. It was really fun. But they actually had about half a dozen different scenes over the course of the evening. And I have to admit, it was the best night of television that wasn't television that I've ever experienced. It was, I felt like when I was a kid and we'd all sit in front of the TV on Sunday nights, we watched Bonanza and Ed Sullivan, all these different shows, Mission Impossible, all these great shows. And it was just there, and it was the big show. And it was just quite interesting. But I also thought, well, it's even better than TV, which at that time, that sort of use of TV. Now I think we look at television as kind of a form of electronic wallpaper. We have all kinds of screens going on at the same time. But back then it was like the hearth. You'd all gather around it, and instead of the wise old man or Stephen, wise young man, telling us stories, the TV told us the story. But it felt like that, and it was a great thing. I hope they bring it back, and if it does, I think we should all go because the beer was also cheap.
Sounds like a great idea. All right, we have about 5 minutes left. If anyone in the chat has any comments, feel free to jump in. I just have one last question on my list here, which is how do you see a project through to completion? I'm certain there's plenty of writers who struggle with that. So, Stephen, would you like to give us your insight?
Well, I just make sure that the characters actually want to complete. The characters take on a life of their own, and they say that we're not going to stop this. So I always have, actually, one of the things I always have in anything that I write is that driven, nearly fanatical character. Because they're what pulls me through, because they're the ones that are getting in my face at 3 a.m. and saying, you can't sleep now, you have to finish, you can't leave me in this situation. And if I don't have that driven character there, I actually have a couple of things that are half finished, and they've been half finished for years, and I'm going to go back to them and finish them eventually. But I'm going to have to rewrite one of the characters to be that driven one, because I need that driven one to get in my face and make me do it.
I like that strategy. I can probably guess, but who was that character in Cloning Freedom?
Ryan.
There's definitely a few characters I could have guessed for that one. Mildred was definitely a strong pusher, as well as Tansy. Two of the antagonists in the story. They kept him going the whole way through, and I could definitely see that.
There were several of them there.
Yeah, there were a lot of strong personalities in Cloning Freedom and in Freedom's Law.
Yeah, well, it's too easy if you don't have strong personalities on both sides. Then just one locomodes over the others.
That's actually excellent advice. I highly approve, and thank you for sharing. So, Hugh, how do you see a project through completion?
Well, that's one. I think earlier you mentioned the acknowledgments of the book Hench, which names off all many of the members of the Cecil Street Writers Group, and Natalie did that for us, and which is very nice of her. But maybe like Natalie, but definitely with me, I owe a lot to the workshopping process, because as the cycle through every day, because we usually do one or two authors in each session each week, it's your turn, and you better have something for the group to work through. So we all had to make sure if you were working on this actively.
And I'm sure also, I'm sure with a group like that, you probably also have at least a few people, at each session going, well, where's the next chapter?
That's right. And things get, and you sort of, there's sort of a dialogue, but also there's great ideas that get thrown around, and it sort of helps you. I didn't create the title for Extreme Dentistry. That was Michael Skeets. He came up with that, and I thought, well, just write that down and take it. Yeah, but since it's my story, so I owe a lot to that. And if you can get involved, people listening can get involved with the workshop. A good one. There are certain rules you need to do, but there's ways you can research how to do a Milford method is one, or the Clarion method has some things that you can adapt. If you can get in the Clarion workshop, that it's a wonderful opportunity. The other thing that maybe relates a little bit to what Steve was saying is that there is a bit of anger. It's hard to say because I'm such an adorable, affable fellow. There's a lot of anger in my writing, and which is why it tends to be humorous because you cloak it that way. And one of my professors once said, the one that I couldn't stand at university, said, Hugh, you do really good work when you're angry. And first, certainly with extreme dentistry, but certainly with some of the stories and with the new one, Hard Side of the Moon, there's some outrage that's driving a lot of it, and I want to get through to the end of it and make a statement. And so maybe that's a little like your driven characters, Stephen. That something needs to be done. Attention must be paid, as they said about Willie Loman and the Death of a Salesman. So,
thank you. Well, this has been a fantastic conversation. It's now just about 10 o'clock. Any final thoughts that either of you would like to share?
The phrase, just do it. Don't make excuses. Just sit down and write, because it's been said that writing is easy. You just sit in front of the keyboard and work until beads of blood form on your forehead. And
easy, nothing to it.
Do it. Yeah.
What I would say, I would echo what Stephen said. I'd also say it doesn't have to be that dramatic, but you still do have to do it. The other thing is that avoid, don't worry about Mrs. Martinson, my grade 2 teacher, in the back of your head who's criticizing everything you're writing down and saying it's no good. It may be no good, but there's somebody out there writing something that's far, far worse than you're writing. And if you keep working at it, maybe what you're writing will be better and actually quite good. So, and you'll be happy with it, and maybe you'll express that be able to share that with other people. So.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both for all of your discussion and your advice. This has been a great session. So, thank you. Joel Ader says, thanks, Catherine and Hugh and Stephen. Enjoyed it. Likewise. Have a great night, and we'll see you at the next stream.